The sun bled out across the Arizona horizon, a violent smear of orange and deep purple that offered no comfort, only a final, searing heat before the chill of the desert night. It was 1876, a year of centennial celebrations back east, but out here, time was measured in dust and distance, in the cracked leather of a rein and the groan of a wagon wheel. The Pinal Creek stagecoach station was less a building and more a suggestion of one, its adobe walls crumbling under the relentless assault of the sun, its wooden sign a splintered ghost of a forgotten name. It smelled of horse sweat, dry earth, and the faint, bitter scent of alkali dust. This was a land that tolerated men but never welcomed them. Inside the belly of the conquered stagecoach, a world of its own existed, cramped and ripe with the scent of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco. A salesman with a thinning mustache nervously polished a sample case. A door-faced woman in black clutched a Bible to her chest, and two prospectors argued in low, gravelly whispers about a claim that likely existed only in their whiskey-soaked dreams. They were all bound for Prescott, chasing fortunes or fleeing ghosts, crammed together by necessity but separated by a universe of private despairs. And then there was Carter Boone. He occupied the rear bench not merely as a passenger, but as a feature of the landscape itself, as immovable and silent as the distant mesas. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, his shoulders broad enough to strain the seams of his dusty canvas coat, his long legs stretched out before him, crossed at the ankles of his worn leather boots. A low-slung gun belt with a holstered Colt Peacemaker rested on his hips, not as a threat, but as a simple, undeniable fact. His face, shadowed by the brim of a stained cattleman hat, was a roadmap of sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of long days and longer nights. He hadn't spoken a word since boarding at the last stop, hadn't even seemed to breathe the same air as the others. He just watched the dying light, his stillness a palpable force, a gravity well that bent the chatter and fidgeting of the other passengers away from him. No one sat on his bench. The empty space beside him was not an invitation, but a declaration of solitude. The driver, a leather-faced man named Hank, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Last call for the dusk-bound. We're moving. The final passenger was a flutter of movement, a frantic gasp of air in the suffocating stillness of the evening. She appeared at the coach door as if blown in by the last gust of wind, a girl on the very edge of womanhood. Her dress was made of cheap cotton, a faded calico print that had seen too much sun and too many washings. It hung on a frame that was all sharp angles and delicate bones, too thin for this harsh country. Her face, pale and smudged with dust, was dominated by eyes the color of a stormy sky, wide with a fear that seemed too old for her years. In her hands, she clutched a small cloth satchel, her knuckles white and raw. She paused at the door, her gaze darting over the occupants of the coach. She saw the salesman's assessing glance, the woman's pinched disapproval, the prospector's sudden, leering interest. Every seat seemed taken, not just by a body, but by a judgment. Her eyes scanned, desperate, until they landed on the empty space on the rear bench, the space next to the silent, formidable man in the dark hat. For a moment, she froze. Her gaze met the hard line of his jaw, the unmoving shadow under his hat. He was a wall, a mountain, a danger she couldn't possibly measure, but the danger behind her, the one she was running from, was a known and terrible thing. Of the two, this silent unknown was the lesser fear. Taking a shallow, trembling breath, she hoisted herself up the steps. The floorboards creaked under her slight weight. She moved with a skittish grace, like a fawn venturing into a clearing, every muscle tensed for flight. She didn't look at him as she slid onto the bench, pressing herself into the far corner, making her world as small as possible. She was a whisper of a person, trying to take up no space at all. She tucked her satchel onto her lap, her hands folded over it as if in prayer. Carter Boone did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge her presence with so much as a flicker of an eyelash. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the last sliver of sun dipping below the jagged teeth of the distant mountains. But he was aware of her. He felt the subtle shift in the coach's balance, smelled the faint scent of lye soap and fear that clung to her clothes, heard the frantic, bird-like beat of her heart in the sudden, profound silence she had brought with her. The coach lurched forward, the crack of Hank's whip a gunshot in the twilight. The journey resumed, a rhythmic rocking and creaking that became the world's only song. Inside, the salesman began a low, droning pitch to the prospectors, who had lost interest in the girl and returned to their gold-laced fantasies. The woman in black read her Bible by the fading light, her lips moving in a silent, ceaseless prayer. The girl beside Carter did not move. She sat ramrod straight, her back not touching the worn leather of the seat, as if she feared leaving an impression. Her world was the grimy window beside her, the blur of saguaro cacti standing like lonely sentinels against the deepening twilight. But every few minutes, her eyes would slide sideways, a brief, cautious glance at the man beside her. She saw the hand that rested on his knee, the fingers long and calloused, the knuckles scarred. It was a hand that knew hard work and, she suspected, hard violence. She saw the edge of the dark stubble that covered his jaw, the pulse that beat slow and steady in the tanned column of his neck. He was a creature of immense and patient control. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a coiled energy, a watchfulness that missed nothing. He was a hawk, still and serene on a thermal, seeing everything on the ground below, and she was a field mouse, frozen in the open. Hours crawled by. The landscape dissolved into a sea of monochrome shadows under a spray of cold, distant stars. The air inside the coach grew stale and chilly. The girl shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. It offered little warmth. The chill was inside her, a deep and settled thing. Their next stop was a swing station called Verde Crossing, a miserable huddle of buildings that seemed to crouch by the riverbank as if in fear. A saloon leaked yellow light and the discordant plinking of a badly tuned piano into the darkness. It was a place for the horses to be changed and for the passengers to stretch their legs and seek a moment's respite. As the coach shuddered to a halt, most of the passengers clambered out, eager for a break. Carter Boone remained where he was, unmoving. The girl hesitated, her body aching from the rigid posture she had maintained for hours. She needed to move, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the ghosts of a dozen breaths. Cautiously, she slid off the bench and stepped down onto the hard-packed earth. The air was sharp and cold, a welcome shock after the stuffiness of the coach. She walked a few paces away, wrapping her arms around herself, watching her breath plume in the moonlight. She did not notice the man who had detached himself from the shadows of the saloon until he was almost upon her. He was one of the prospectors from the coach, a large, barrel-chested man named Jeb, his face flushed with cheap whiskey, his eyes holding a greedy, unpleasant shine. He smelled of sour mash and stale sweat. "Well now, look what we have here," he slurred, his voice a low rumble, a little songbird, all alone in the dark. The girl froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, her heel hitting a loose stone. "No need to be shy," Jeb said, stepping forward, closing the distance between them. He reached out a thick, grimy hand and grabbed her arm. His grip was like a blacksmith's vice. "Just want to be friendly. A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be traveling all by her lonesome." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her voice was a dry rasp in her throat. "Please, let me go." "Not till we've had a proper introduction." He chuckled, his other hand coming up to touch her hair. She flinched, a full body recoil from his touch. She tried to pull her arm free, but his grip only tightened, bruising her skin. Her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. Her eyes darted around the station yard. Hank, the driver, was busy with the horses. The other passengers were inside the station house. No one was looking. No one saw. She was alone, just as he'd said. from inside the coach. Carter Boone had not appeared to move. His hat was still tipped low, his body relaxed in the shadows, but his eyes were open, and they were no longer watching the horizon. They were fixed on the scene unfolding in the moonlight. 2 points of cold, hard steel. He saw the girl's terror, the way her body trembled, the desperate, silent plea in her posture. He saw the man's crude confidence, the possessive brutality in his grip. He did nothing. He didn't rise. He didn't call out. He simply shifted his weight, a minute adjustment of his shoulders, and he tilted his head. It was a small movement, a gesture that might have meant nothing, but it brought his face out of the deep shadow of his hat's brim. The moonlight caught the flat planes of his cheeks, the hard set of his mouth, and the utter, chilling emptiness in his eyes. It was a gaze that held no anger, no heat. It was colder than that. It was the dispassionate, final gaze of a predator that had just been disturbed. It was a look that promised nothing but an ending. Jeb, in his drunken haze, felt it before he saw it, a sudden prickling on the back of his neck, a primal instinct screaming that a line had been crossed. He looked up from the girl's terrified face, and his eyes met Carter's. The whiskey fire in his gut turned to ice. He was no stranger to bar fights and back-alley brawls, to the casual violence of men in this lawless land. But this was different. This wasn't a threat. It was a certainty. He was looking at a man who could unmake him, and would do so with no more thought than swatting a fly. The silence from the coach was louder than any shouted warning. It was the silence of the grave. His grip on the girl's arm slackened. His bravado evaporated, leaving behind a sour, clammy fear. He let go of her as if his hand had been burned, without another word, without a backward glance. Jebediah turned and stumbled back toward the saloon, melting into the shadows from which he had emerged. The girl stood frozen for a long moment, the feeling of his hand still a phantom brand on her skin. She was breathing again, deep, shuddering gulps of the cold night air. She rubbed her arm, a tremor running through her, when she finally looked toward the coach, toward the man who had saved her without a word or a step. He had already retreated back into the shadows. His head was no longer tilted. His face was once again obscured by his hat. It was as if nothing had happened. She walked back to the coach on unsteady legs and climbed the steps. She slid back into her corner seat, the space between them now charged with a powerful, unspoken current. She did not know his name. She did not know his destination or his past, but she knew the weight of his silence. She looked at him then, a direct and steady gaze. Her eyes, no longer wide with panic, were filled with a profound and silent gratitude. It was a look that said more than words ever could. It acknowledged his power, her vulnerability, and the invisible shield he had placed around her. "Thank you." Carter Boone's gaze remained on the dark landscape outside, but in the reflection on the glass, he saw her look. He gave no sign that he had, no nod of acknowledgement, no softening of his features. He simply continued to watch the night, a silent guardian on the last seat of the dusk-bound stage, and for the first time in a very long time, the girl felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach loosen. Just a little. The air inside the coach was thick with the residue of fear. After the incident at Verde Crossing, a brittle silence had descended, heavier and more oppressive than the previous quiet. Jeb, the prospector, sat hunched in his corner, nursing a bottle he'd purchased from the saloon, his eyes sullen and downcast. He did not look at the girl, nor did he look at the man on the back bench. He seemed to be actively trying to shrink, to become a smaller, less noticeable target. The other passengers, having witnessed the brief, silent confrontation, now cast nervous glances toward the rear of the coach. The tall, quiet man was no longer just an aloof cowboy. He was a coiled threat, a guardian, a mystery they were too afraid to solve. For the girl, the world had been remade in the span of a single heartbeat, the space beside Carter Boone. Once a void of intimidation, had become a sanctuary. She was intensely aware of him, of the solid mass of his shoulder a hand's breadth from her own, of the slow, even rhythm of his breathing that seemed to anchor the swaying, jolting chaos of the coach. She no longer felt the need to press herself against the far wall. She simply sat, allowing the motion of their travel to occasionally bring her fractionally closer to him. A slight brush of her worn shawl against his canvas coat that felt like a fortress wall. The sun rose, unforgiving and white-hot, bleaching the color from the sky. The landscape unfolded in a monotonous panorama of rock and scrub, of dust devils dancing in the distance like tormented spirits. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the coach, baking the occupants in their own sweat and anxiety. Dust, fine as flour, seeped through every crack, coating their clothes, their faces, the backs of their throats. Through it all, Carter remained a study in stillness. His gaze was fixed on the terrain ahead, but his attention seemed different now. It was sharper, more focused. Before, he had looked at the horizon with the detached patience of a man simply passing time. Now, his eyes scanned the ridges and arroyos, the jagged rock formations that littered the landscape like broken teeth. He was reading the land, searching its empty spaces for signs and portents that were invisible to everyone else. The girl watched his hands. She noticed the way his right hand, which had previously rested on his knee, now hung loosely at his side, his thumb hooked over his gun belt, his fingers inches from the worn walnut grip of his Colt. It wasn't an aggressive posture, but one of absolute readiness, a storm gathering under a calm sky. The day wore on, a long, grueling stretch of heat and rattling discomfort. Around midday, as the coach navigated a narrow pass flanked by high, sun-scorched canyon walls, the feeling in the air shifted. It was a subtle change, a tightening of the atmosphere. The horses grew skittish, their ears twitching, their whinnies sharp with anxiety. Hank, the driver, cursed under his breath, his whip cracking with a nervous, irregular rhythm. Carter's body, which had been relaxed, drew into a state of quiet tension. He didn't move, but the stillness was different now. It was the lethal calm of a panther before the pounce. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowed, scanning the top of the canyon walls. The girl's heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She followed his gaze but saw nothing but shimmering heat and red rock. Yet she trusted his senses more than her own. Fear, cold and familiar, began to creep up her spine. It happened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. A rifle shot cracked from the ridge above, the sound echoing sharp and flat in the narrow pass. The bullet splintered the wooden frame of the driver's seat, a breath away from Hank's head. The horses screamed and reared. Hank hauled back on the reins with all his might, the coach slewing sideways with a groan of tortured wood and metal, coming to a shuddering halt. "Everybody down," Hank bellowed, his voice tight with panic. Screams erupted inside the coach. The salesman dove to the floorboards, covering his head. The woman in black began to pray aloud, her words a frantic, desperate litany. From the rocks above, 3 riders appeared, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas. They spurred their horses down the steep embankment, rifles held loosely in their hands, their movements confident and predatory. "Throw down the box," one of them yelled, his voice a rough, grating command. The girl was paralyzed. Her mind went white with a terror so pure it felt like ice water in her veins. All she could see were the dark figures descending, the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, the end of her desperate flight arriving in a storm of dust and violence. In that moment of absolute chaos, Carter Boone moved. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. As the other passengers scrambled and shrieked, he seemed to enter a pocket of calm, his actions economical and precise. He didn't duck or take cover. He simply drew his gun. The Colt Peacemaker appeared in his hand not with a flourish, but with a quiet finality, as if it were an extension of his own arm. The girl, in her terror, had instinctively pressed herself back, seeking the small shelter of his large frame. She was now behind him, her hands covering her mouth to stifle a scream, her eyes wide, watching everything unfold over the broad plain of his back. The lead rider was leveling his rifle, a cruel grin visible above his bandana. He was taking his time, enjoying their fear. Carter's arm rose. He didn't aim at the man's chest or his head. The barrel of the Colt lifted slightly higher. He fired a single shot. The report of his pistol was utterly distinct from the bandit's rough rifle fire. It was a sharp, authoritative crack that sliced through the air with a surgical precision. The bullet didn't find flesh. It found the felt of the lead rider's hat, plucking it clean from his head and sending it cartwheeling into the air. For a split second, the hat hung suspended against the bright blue sky before tumbling into the dust. A profound silence fell over the canyon. The screams inside the coach died. The bandits froze, their confident swagger vanishing. The lead rider stared, his hand reaching up to touch his now bare head, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. That single shot was not a miss. It was a message, delivered with a skill that was more terrifying than a killing blow. It said, "I can take your hat from 50 yards. Imagine what I can do to your eye." It spoke of a cold, effortless lethality that these roadside thugs could not hope to match. The leader stared down at Carter, who had not moved, the barrel of his Colt still smoking faintly, aimed not at any of them, but at the empty space between them. The rider's gaze met Carter's, and what he saw there made the sweat on his brow turn cold. He saw nothing, no anger, no fear, no excitement, just a calm, waiting abyss. He cursed, a raw, frustrated sound, and yanked hard on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. "Let's go, it ain't worth it," he snarled to his companions. Without another shot being fired, the three men spurred their horses and galloped away, disappearing back into the rocks as quickly as they had appeared. They were swallowed by the landscape, leaving behind only a cloud of settling dust and a ringing silence. Inside the coach, the aftermath was a jumble of ragged sobs and shaky breaths. The salesman was still on the floor. The woman was weeping into her hands. Hank, the driver, slowly lowered his own pistol, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The girl remained pressed behind Carter, her body trembling uncontrollably. The terror was only just beginning to recede, leaving behind a tidal wave of shock. She could feel the solid warmth of his back against her cheek, smell the scent of sun-warmed canvas, dust, and the faint, sharp tang of gunpowder. He was an anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. He hadn't said a word. He had simply acted, a bulwark against the violence of the world. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he holstered his weapon. The click of the gun sliding into the leather was a sound of finality. He turned his head slightly, his gaze still directed out the window, but he was aware of her huddled behind him. In the ringing silence, her voice was a small, fragile thing, barely a whisper. What is your name?" He didn't answer for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the ragged breathing of the other passengers and the distant cry of a hawk. He then reached down for the canteen that rested by his foot. He uncorked it and held it out to her, his back still mostly turned. The gesture was simple, practical. It was not a rejection of her question, but an answer to a more immediate need he saw in her. His eyes, reflected in the window glass, had noted the paleness of her lips, the violent tremor in her hands. He was offering not his name, but succor, a grounding in a world that had just spun off its axis. She took the canteen with fumbling fingers. The metal was cool against her skin. She lifted it to her lips and drank, the water tasting of metal and salvation. It cut through the dust in her throat and seemed to quench a fire deep inside her. When she was done, she handed it back, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric second. The rest of the journey passed in a haze. No one spoke. The failed ambush had stripped away any pretense of normalcy, leaving them all raw and exposed. when dusk finally began to settle, tinting the bruised sky in shades of violet and gray. Hank pulled the weary team to a stop in a deserted yard. Before them stood the skeleton of a homestead, a collapsed sod house and a large, dilapidated barn, its roof sagging, its doors hanging askew from broken hinges. "This is it for the night," Hank announced, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Safer to be off the road. We'll sleep in the barn." There were groans of complaint, but no one argued. The barn, for all its decay, offered 4 walls and a roof, a meager defense against the vast, menacing emptiness of the night. They filed into the cavernous space. It smelled of ancient hay, dry rot, and the ghosts of long-gone animals. Moonlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, painting stripes of silver across the dusty floor. The passengers claimed their spaces, collapsing into piles of hay with weary sighs, pulling their coats and blankets around them for warmth. A small, miserable community of strangers, bound by a shared day of terror. The girl could not rest. She sat with her back against a rough-hewn pillar, her arms wrapped around her knees, her small satchel clutched tightly in her lap. Every gust of wind whistling through the walls sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The memory of the riders, of the rifle shot, of Jeb's leering face played over and over in her mind. Across the barn, away from everyone else, Carter Boone sat with his back against the far wall. He had taken no hay for a bed, sought no comfort. He just sat, his hat tipped low, a silent, solitary sentinel. He appeared to be resting, but she knew he was not. He was watching, listening. His stillness was not sleep. It was a vigil. The minutes bled into an hour. The snores of the salesman and the quiet weeping of the woman in black filled the space. But the girl's fear would not subside. It was a living thing inside her, a cold, sharp-toothed animal. She felt terribly, utterly alone. Her gaze kept returning to the dark silhouette across the barn. He was the only source of safety she had known all day. The thought of spending the night alone in her own corner, starting at every sound, was unbearable. Making a decision, she rose to her feet. She moved with infinite care, her bare feet making no sound on the dirt floor. She crept across the open space, a small, ghost-like figure in the moonlight. She stopped a few feet from him, her heart pounding a heavy, suffocating rhythm. He did not move, but she felt his awareness of her, a palpable shift in the air. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet it was nearly carried away by the wind. "Sir!" He didn't speak. He simply tilted his head, the same slight movement he'd made at the station. May I sleep near you?" The words tumbled out in a rush, a desperate plea just for safety. For a long moment, he was completely still. Then, slowly, his eyes opened. In the faint moonlight, she couldn't read their expression, but she could feel their weight. They weren't questioning, or surprised, or annoyed. They were just seeing her, seeing the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion and fear etched on her face. He understood what she wasn't saying. He understood the why, without needing to hear it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a single small movement that felt as solid and reassuring as the earth itself. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She sank down into the hay a few feet from his side, pulling her thin shawl around her. She did not dare get any closer, but it was enough. She was within the circle of his watchfulness, with the solid, silent presence of the man with no name beside her. She finally closed her eyes, and for the first time since she'd fled her old life, she felt the possibility of sleep. Sleep was a distant shore she could not reach, lying in the rustling hay. The girl Eliana felt as though she were floating in a cold, dark sea, buffeted by the waves of a day that had torn her fragile sense of safety to shreds. The barn was a breathing entity around her, groaning with each gust of wind that pressed against its ancient timbers. Moonlight, filtered through the gapped roof, was a spectral artist, painting shifting patterns of silver and black on the dirt floor. From across the cavernous space came the wretched, bubbling snores of the salesman and the soft, whimpering breaths of the woman who clutched her Bible even in sleep. They were the sounds of a world moving on, a world to which Eliana no longer felt she belonged. Her fear, which had momentarily subsided, returned with the encroaching chill. It was a different fear now, not the sharp, immediate terror of a rifle shot, but the deeper, more insidious dread that came from memory. The violence of the day had been a key, turning the lock on a room in her mind she had tried so desperately to seal shut. Now, the door was wide open, and the ghosts of her recent past were walking free. She was acutely aware of the man beside her. He had not moved since she had settled in the hay. He sat against the wall, a solid, unmoving silhouette. She could not tell if he was awake or asleep. His stillness was absolute, yet his presence was the only thing keeping the ghosts at bay. He was a rock in the churning sea of her anxiety, and she clung to the thought of him, the quiet reality of his nearness. A memory surfaced, unbidden, as sharp and clear as a shard of glass, the scent of beeswax and old paper, her father's study, a room where the light was always dim, filtered through stained glass that depicted stern-faced prophets. Her father, Reverend Thompson, was a man carved from the same hard wood as his pulpit, his face a mask of pious certainty, his eyes tools for judging the souls of his flock. He had summoned her there a month ago, his voice devoid of warmth, filled only with the weight of scripture and paternal authority. "Eliana," he had said, his fingers steepled before him. "Mr. Sterling has made a most generous offer. He is a man of considerable means and influence in Texas. He requires a wife of good breeding and unimpeachable virtue. You shall be that wife." She remembered the way the words had stolen the air from her lungs. She was 17. She had never spoken more than a dozen words to Mr. Sterling, a wealthy liquor merchant who had attended her father's church for a few weeks. His donations conspicuously large, his gaze conspicuously cold. "Father, There is nothing to discuss," he had interrupted, his voice cutting like a razor. "It is a providential match. You will honor your father, and you will honor God by accepting this station with grace and obedience." She had looked at him then, at this man who was supposed to be her protector, and saw only a stranger making a transaction. She was a commodity, her virtue a selling point, her future a thing to be bartered for influence and favor. A gust of wind rattled the barn door. Pulling her back to the present, she shivered, drawing her thin shawl tighter. The hay pricked at her skin. Beside her, Carter Boone shifted his weight, the movement almost imperceptible, the creak of his leather gun belt a soft, reassuring sound in the darkness. The memory of her father's study dissolved, replaced by another. The wedding day. The church had felt as cold as a tomb. She remembered the suffocating scent of wilting lilies and the oppressive weight of the lace veil her mother had worn, a relic from a happier time. She saw Mr. Sterling at the altar, a man twice her age, impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit. He was not overtly monstrous. He was handsome, in a severe, polished way, his silver-streaked hair combed back perfectly, his hands meticulously clean, but his eyes, the color of wet slate, held no light, no warmth. When he had slipped the heavy gold band on her finger, his touch was cold, possessive, the touch of a man claiming property. Their home in Texas was a mansion, vast and silent, filled with heavy, ornate furniture and shadowed by thick velvet curtains that were never drawn back. It was a beautiful prison. Mr. Sterling treated her with a chillingly formal courtesy. He called her my dear in a voice that held no affection, and praised her quiet demeanor, for it befitted a woman of her station. His brutality was not of the fist, but of the soul. He suffocated her with his expectations, with his absolute control. He chose her clothes, dictated her meals, and corrected her posture. She was his finest acquisition, a testament to his wealth and taste, and he expected her to be flawless. She began to speak. The words were not a decision, but a release, a slow leak of pressure from a wound that had been festering in silence. Her voice was a bare whisper, meant more for the darkness than for the man beside her. "My father, he is a preacher." The words hung in the cold air. She didn't know if he had heard, or if he was even awake. She paused, her heart hammering, but he made no sign. His silence was a canvas, and she felt compelled to fill it. "He said it was God's will," another piece of the story, another shard of glass, "that I should marry a man, a Mr. Sterling. He trades in liquor, in Texas." The irony was not lost on her. Even then, her pious father, who preached against the evils of drink, had sold his only daughter to a man who had built an empire on it. She remembered the first week of her marriage, a week of silent dinners at a polished mahogany table, so long she could barely see her husband at the other end. A week of walking through cold, echoing rooms, her reflection staring back at her from a dozen gilded mirrors. She had a new name, a new home, a new life, but she had never felt more like a ghost. The escape had been an act not of courage, but of pure, animal instinct. It happened on the 7th night. Mr. Sterling was away on business. She lay in the enormous, cold bed, staring at the canopy above, and realized that if she did not leave, the part of her that was still Eliana would simply wither and die. She would become another one of the house's beautiful, lifeless objects. She had slipped out of bed, her movements furtive and silent. She did not take any of the fine dresses or jewels her husband had bought her. They were part of the cage. She put on her old calico dress, the one she had arrived in. From the kitchen, she took a small, sharp paring knife, its purpose unclear in her mind, for protection, for cutting food, or perhaps for something more desperate. From the bottom of her travel trunk, she retrieved the only thing that truly felt like hers, a small, simple cross, carved from dark wood, that had belonged to her mother. It was smooth and worn from years of her mother's touch. With these 2 items and a few coins tucked into her small cloth satchel, she had slipped out of the grand house and into the vast, terrifying darkness of the Texas night. She had been running ever since. Her whisper filled the small space between them again, raw and trembling with the memory of it all. "I ran away. A week after the wedding." She hugged her knees tighter, trying to hold herself together. The telling of it, even in these broken pieces, was making her unravel. His hands were always so cold. The confession was a desperate, final thing, the heart of her misery laid bare in the anonymous dark. "I've never kissed anyone." Her voice broke on the words, a small, hitching sob. "Not really, not with a choice." She took a ragged breath. "I've never been allowed to choose anything for myself." This was the ultimate truth. It was not just the forced marriage, or the cold husband, or the suffocating house. It was the utter absence of choice. Her life had been a path laid out by her father, a contract signed by her husband. Not a single step had been her own. A profound, heavy silence followed her words. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, she felt a terrible shame, a deep, burning regret for having spoken. She had burdened this silent stranger with the sordid, pathetic story of her life. She had exposed her weakness, her foolishness. She braced herself for a response, for a grunt of dismissal, for him to get up and move away, for anything that would confirm her foolishness. Carter Boone did not move away. He did not speak. He did not even turn his head. For a long, stretched moment, he did nothing at all. Then, he reached for the woolen horse blanket that lay beside him. It was a thick, coarse thing, smelling faintly of leather and horse and the clean, cold air of the high desert. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached over and gently, carefully, draped the blanket over her trembling shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so quiet, it stunned her into silence. His hand did not touch her skin. His fingers simply arranged the heavy wool, ensuring it covered her completely, and then retreated. The weight of the blanket was immediate, a comforting pressure. The warmth began to seep into her, chasing away the deep, settled chill in her bones. But it was more than the warmth of the wool. It was the warmth of the gesture itself. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness. It asked for nothing. It judged nothing. It simply offered comfort. All her life, every touch had been one of ownership or duty. Her father's hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward his will. Mr. Sterling's cold fingers on her arm, leading her into the gilded cage of his home. They were touches that took, that possessed, that claimed. This was different. This was a touch that gave. It offered protection without demanding submission. It offered warmth without requiring anything in return. Lying there in the dark, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, smelling the honest scents of his life. Eliana felt a sensation so foreign she could barely name it. For the first time in her memory, she felt she had been touched without being touched at all, and in that quiet, profound paradox, a single, warm tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She was not safe from the world, not yet, but for tonight, in the shadow of this silent man, she was safe enough. Dawn arrived not with a bang, but a whisper. A soft, pearlescent light crept over the eastern horizon, painting the undersides of the high, thin clouds in hues of rose and pale lavender. The harsh, unforgiving landscape of the previous day was softened by this gentle light, its sharp edges blurred, its raw colors muted. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, lonely cry of a mourning dove. Inside the barn, Eliana stirred from a sleep so deep it felt like a resurrection. She was cocooned in a warmth that was not her own, her cheek resting on the coarse, comforting wool of Carter Boone's horse blanket. For a fleeting, disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. There was no oppressive silence of a grand house, no fear of a cold hand or a dismissive voice. There was only the gentle morning light, the chirping of sparrows in the rafters, and the slow, steady rhythm of her own breathing. She had slept. Truly, deeply slept. For the first time in what felt like an eternity. She sat up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her body ached from the hard ground, but it was a simple, honest ache, a reminder that she was alive and whole. Across the barn, the other passengers were beginning to stir, their movements sluggish, their voices thick with sleep and complaint. They were ghosts from a life she already felt herself drifting away from. Her eyes found him immediately. He was standing in the massive, open doorway of the barn, a tall silhouette against the burgeoning light. He was looking out at the sunrise, his hat in his hand, held loosely at his side. The morning light caught the lines of his face, revealing a weariness she hadn't seen before, a profound solitude that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a stone. He had not slept. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. He had kept watch all night, a silent guardian over the wretched, fitful sleep of strangers, a guardian over her. A hot flush of shame and gratitude washed over her. Her whispered confession in the dark felt like a fever dream now. She had unburdened herself to this man, laid the pathetic story of her life at his feet. What must he think of her? A weak, foolish girl running from a mess of her own making. She expected to see pity or contempt in his eyes, but when he finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the waking occupants of the barn, his expression was as impassive as the rock of the canyons. His eyes met hers for a brief, unreadable moment before moving on. He had heard her story, and he had kept it, locking it away behind that silent, unreadable facade. The routine of departure began, a clumsy, graceless affair. Hank the driver, his temper frayed, bellowed orders about the horses. The salesman fussed over his sample case, wiping away the dust with a grimy handkerchief. Jeb and his companion drank the last of their whiskey. their faces pale and puffy in the morning light. They were all eager to be gone, to put the terror of the previous day and the discomfort of the night behind them. For Eliana, the thought of leaving was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. The stagecoach, which had once represented a desperate flight toward freedom, now seemed like a cage on wheels. It would carry her away from this place, away from the first real sense of security she had ever known. It would deliver her back into a world of leering men and lonely roads, a world where she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Where would she even go? She had no destination, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. The future was a blank, terrifying void. She folded the horse blanket with meticulous care, the rough wool still holding the warmth of her body. She had to return it. She had to thank him. The words felt heavy and inadequate in her mouth. How do you thank a man who saved you from bandits, who defended you without a word, who listened to your darkest secrets and offered you his warmth against the cold? She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the dusty ground. He was coiling a rope, his movements fluid and economical, his large hands working with an ingrained, effortless competence. He looked up as she approached, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat, which was now back in its place. "Sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She held out the folded blanket. "Thank you." He stopped what he was doing and took the blanket from her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, a spark of warmth against her cold skin. He didn't say "you're welcome." He just gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and turned to stow the blanket with his saddle. "Time to move!" Girly Hank yelled from the coach. The other passengers were already aboard, their faces pale and impatient, framed in the windows. "We're burning daylight." The summons was a physical blow. This was it. The moment was over. She had to go. A wave of desolation, so powerful it threatened to pull her under, washed over her. She turned, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Each step toward the coach felt like walking to a gallows. The world of fear and uncertainty was waiting for her, its doors wide open. She placed a foot on the first step, her hand reaching for the rail. A hand closed around her wrist. The touch was firm, warm, and utterly shocking. It stopped her cold. She froze, her foot hovering over the step, her body rigid. It was Carter. He stood behind her, his grip not painful, but unyielding, an anchor. Slowly, she turned to face him. The world seemed to drop away. The impatient shouts of the driver, the creaking of the coach, the vast, empty landscape, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the dusty space between them, charged with a sudden, breathtaking intensity. She looked up into his face. For the first time, she saw him clearly, without the filter of her own fear. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were not cold. They were filled with a deep, quiet gravity. She saw the fine lines etched at their corners from squinting into 1,000 suns, the dark stubble that shadowed a firm, resolute jaw. Her own eyes, she knew, were red-rimmed and swollen, raw with the unshed tears of a lifetime. He did not speak. Words were not his language. He simply lowered his head, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. She could not. She was held captive not by his hand, but by the question in his eyes. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of conquest. It was a kiss of profound and startling tenderness. His lips were dry and warm, the brief touch as light as the desert wind, as gentle as the morning light. It was a hesitant, questioning thing, a whisper of a touch that asked for nothing and offered everything. It was a single, perfect moment of stillness in a world that had never stopped spinning. It was the first kiss of her life. It was the first choice. Then, just as slowly, he pulled back. He released her wrist and turned away, picking up his saddle as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just redrawn the map of her entire world. The moment was over, but for Eliana, it was the beginning of everything. She stood frozen, her fingers rising to touch her lips, where the ghost of his touch still lingered. A single, silent tear finally escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. The world rushed back in, loud and insistent. "For the last time. Miss, are you comin' or ain't you?" Hank's voice was sharp with exasperation. The coach door stood open like a dark, waiting mouth. It represented her past, her flight, her loneliness. She looked at it, then back at Carter, who was now saddling his horse, his back to her. He had given her a moment of impossible tenderness, and then turned away, leaving her to choose. The cruelty and the kindness of it stole her breath. And then he spoke. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, rough from disuse. Yet it carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "There's a place out west." He didn't turn around. He kept his attention on tightening a cinch. "Mine, no one there but wind, chickens, and silence." He paused, his hands stilling for a moment. He turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "You can come, or not." The two final words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Or not. He was not commanding her. He was not even inviting her. He was laying a choice at her feet. A real choice, terrifying and vast. One path led back to the coach, back to the shapeless, lonely fear she knew. The other path led into the west, into a future as unknown as the man who offered it. A man of violence and quiet protection. A man who could take a hat off a rider at 50 yards and offer a blanket to a crying girl. A man who offered kisses as gentle as the wind, and choices as vast as the sky. She looked from the dark maw of the coach to the broad, solid line of his back. It was the most reckless, insane decision of her life. It was the only decision she could possibly make. She gave a single, small nod, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible, but he saw it. Hank, seeing her step back from the coach, threw his hands up in disgust. "Have it your way," he muttered, cracking his whip over the horses' backs. With a lurch and a groan, the stagecoach rumbled out of the yard. Eliana and Carter stood in the swirling dust, watching it go. She watched as the faces of the other passengers disappeared, as the coach became a smaller and smaller speck on the horizon, until it was finally swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. It was gone. Her last connection to the world she had known was gone. She was alone in the middle of nowhere with a man she did not know. And for the first time in her life, she felt the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of freedom. She had chosen. The journey west was a silent pilgrimage. After the stagecoach had vanished, Carter had simply gestured to a second horse, a sturdy-looking sorrel that had been tethered behind the crumbling barn. He had offered no explanation for its presence, and Eliana had asked for none. The world had simplified itself into a singular, unspoken agreement. He led, and she followed. They rode for 2 days. The landscape was a vast, formidable canvas of scorched earth, towering mesas, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like a physical weight. They spoke little. The rhythm of their travel was dictated by the sun and the needs of the horses. Carter would point to a sheltered outcrop for a noonday rest or a hidden spring for water. He shared his jerky and hardtack with her, the simple, honest food tasting better than any of the cold, elaborate meals she'd eaten at Mr. Sterling's table. Eliana learned to read his silence. A slight shift in his saddle meant a change in pace. A hand raised to shield his eyes was a signal to observe the horizon. She watched the way he moved with the land, a part of its harsh and unforgiving beauty. She was a stranger here, a fragile, foreign thing, but in his wake, she felt the first stirrings of a tentative peace. This world was dangerous, but it was not deceptive. Its threats were open and honest, like the heat of the sun or the sudden chill of the night. Late on the second day, he led them up a long, sloping trail that wound around the base of a stony hill. And there it was, his place. It was not a grand ranch, not even a proper farm. It was a testament to one man's stubborn will against the indifference of the land. A small, sturdy cabin, built of dark, hand-hewn logs, stood beside a well-built corral. A chicken coop, patched with scrap wood, housed a half-dozen nervous hens. The earth around the cabin was barren and rocky, but a small patch near the door had been cleared. The soil turned over, waiting for a spring planting. It was a place of profound solitude, perched on a barren hillside, overlooking a valley that stretched for miles. There was nothing else as far as the eye could see, only wind, rock, and silence. As they dismounted, the cabin door opened. A small boy stood on the porch, wiping his hands on a pair of oversized trousers held up by a single suspender. He was perhaps 7 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair, and eyes that were startlingly large and observant in his small, serious face. He looked from Carter to Eliana, his gaze holding a quiet, unnerving intelligence. He did not speak. Carter approached the boy and placed a large hand on his shoulder. He then made a series of small, precise movements with his free hand, a tap on his own chest, a gesture toward Eliana, a circling motion in the air. The boy watched his hands intently, then looked at Eliana again. A flicker of understanding, and perhaps curiosity, passed through his eyes. He gave a small, solemn nod. Eliana stood frozen, her heart aching with a sudden, inexplicable tenderness. The boy's silence was not the sullen quiet of Jeb the prospector, nor the watchful stillness of Carter. It was a complete and total absence of sound. "His name is Samuel," Carter said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to startle the quiet air. It was the most he had spoken at one time since she'd met him. "There was a fire at a church down south a few years back. He was the only one I could get to." He paused, his gaze distant. He can't hear or speak. The simple, unadorned facts settled over Eliana, heavy as stones. She looked at the boy, at his serious, watchful face, and understood. They were a trio of silent souls, washed up on this lonely shore, a man who chose not to speak, a boy who could not, and a woman who was only just learning that she had a voice at all. Life on the barren hill found a new rhythm, one dictated not by the crack of a whip or the tolling of a church bell, but by the rising and setting of the sun. The days were a quiet education in the art of living. Eliana, who had been raised to be an ornament, discovered the simple, profound satisfaction of work. Her first lesson was the well. The water was deep and cold, and the wooden buckets were heavy. The first few times she drew water, her arms trembled with the effort, her back screaming in protest. She would stumble back to the cabin, sloshing half the precious liquid onto the dusty ground. Carter never criticized. He would simply watch, and the next day, he showed her how to brace her feet, how to use the weight of her body to pull the rope, a silent lesson in leverage and patience. Soon, the ache in her muscles became a familiar, satisfying burn. The walk to the well became a morning ritual, a time to feel the cool air on her face and watch the world slowly awaken. The kitchen, a small alcove with a cast-iron stove and a few simple shelves, became her domain. She, who had only ever been served, learned to cook. There was little to work with: flour, beans, salted pork, the occasional egg from the nervous hens. She learned to make a thick, hearty soup that filled the small cabin with a warm, savory steam. She learned to bake a dense, heavy bread that was more sustenance than pleasure. She found a quiet joy in the simple, repetitive motions: chopping vegetables, stirring a pot, kneading dough. In Mr. Sterling's house, the kitchen was a distant territory run by a hired cook. Here, it was the heart of their small world, and she was its keeper. Carter began to teach her other things, skills she never would have imagined needing. He showed her how to properly tie a halter shank, his large, calloused hands moving slowly, demonstrating the knot 3 times before stepping back and waiting for her to replicate it. He taught her how to use a small, sharp knife to whittle. Not for art, but for utility, making a peg for a broken gate, sharpening a stick for a spit. He would sit on the porch in the evenings, the silent boy beside him, and demonstrate the precise angle of the blade, the way to work with the grain of the wood. His instruction was always wordless, a language of pure action. He never touched her. When she fumbled with a knot, he wouldn't take her hands to guide them. He would simply undo his own and begin again, his patience as vast and silent as the landscape around them. In these moments of intense, shared focus, she felt a connection to him that was deeper than any conversation. He was not just protecting her, he was arming her, giving her the tools of self-reliance. His protection remained an invisible, unbreachable wall around her. He never spoke of the dangers that might find them, but his vigilance was constant. One afternoon, a pair of riders appeared at the bottom of the hill. They were prospectors, by the look of their laden mules, and likely harmless. But before they were halfway up the trail, Carter stepped out of the cabin, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't raise it. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable fact. The prospectors saw him, exchanged a few words, and altered their course, disappearing back into the valley. He had stood between her and a danger that might not have even existed, his presence a shield. And every night, after the sun had set and the cabin was filled with the flickering orange light of the stove, she would retreat to the small cot that was now hers. The cabin was a single room, her bed in one corner, his in the other, with the boy's small pallet near the hearth. An invisible line of propriety and respect was drawn between them, a line neither of them ever crossed. Lying in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, she would wait. Soon, she would hear the soft scrape of his chair, then the quiet, heavy tread of his boots on the wooden floorboards. He would walk to the front door, his steps slow and measured. She would hear the faint click as he checked the bolt. Then he would cross the room to the single back window, and she would hear the soft thud of the wooden shutter being secured. This nightly ritual, this quiet patrol of their tiny fortress, became her lullaby. The sounds of a man checking his locks became the sound of absolute safety. The days bled into weeks. The sharp edges of her fear began to soften, worn smooth by the steady, gentle rhythm of her new life. The terror that had been her constant companion, the feeling of always looking over her shoulder, began to recede. It was replaced by the scent of wood smoke, the warmth of baking bread, the solid presence of the man and the boy, and the quiet satisfaction of a day filled with honest, meaningful work. She was no longer running. She was building. Safety was no longer a desperate, fleeting hope she prayed for in the dark. It was the solid feel of the cabin floor beneath her feet. It was the shared silence of a meal eaten by the firelight. It was the sound of a man's footsteps in the night, checking the locks. Safety had become a habit. It had become home. The season began to turn. The relentless, oppressive heat of summer gave way to the crisper, clearer light of autumn. The sun's angle was lower, casting long shadows from the cabin in the early morning and painting the valley in hues of old gold and deep rust in the late afternoon. Time on the homestead was not measured in days of the week, but in the slow, rhythmic cycle of chores, in the shortening of the days, in the deepening of a silence that was no longer empty, but full. Eliana had changed with the season. The frail, terrified girl who had stepped off the stagecoach was a distant memory. The sun and the wind had tanned her skin, and the daily labor of hauling water, chopping wood, and tending to the small garden had given her a wiry strength she'd never known. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now calloused and capable. She moved with a new, quiet confidence, her body attuned to the rhythms of this stark and beautiful land. She had learned the geography of this small world which rocks held the morning sun the longest, where the wind was sharpest, how the light fell across the cabin floor at different hours of the day. She, Carter, and the boy, Samuel had settled into a life of shared, unspoken routine. Mornings were for hard labor. Afternoons were for mending, for cleaning, for the quiet tasks that turned a shelter into a home. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast, ink-black sky. They were a strange, silent constellation of three, a family forged not by blood or by law, but by circumstance and a shared need for stillness. Yet, a question lingered in the quietest corners of Eliana's mind. She had a place at the table, a cot in the corner, a role in the daily functioning of this life, but she did not know what she was. Was she a guest? A hired hand who was paid in room and board? A refugee granted temporary asylum, the kiss at the derelict barn felt like a lifetime ago. A moment of impossible tenderness that had never been repeated or even acknowledged. Carter treated her with a consistent, respectful distance. He was her protector, her teacher, but the man who had kissed her remained hidden behind a wall of silence. She did not know if she was a passing chapter in his solitary life, or if she was meant to stay. One afternoon, while searching for stray pieces of kindling along the dry creek bed at the bottom of the hill, she saw it, in a small, sheltered spot between two large, gray stones. A single flower was blooming. It was a desert marigold, a splash of defiant, brilliant yellow against the drab browns and grays of the earth. It was a small, perfect miracle, its delicate petals open to the sun, its stem wiry and strong. It had fought its way through the gravel and the hard-packed clay to bloom in this unlikely place. Eliana knelt, her breath catching in her throat. The flower seemed to speak to her. It was a symbol of her own survival, a testament to the fact that life could not only endure in the harshest of conditions, but could find a way to create something beautiful. It was a spot of grace in a world of utility. She reached out and, with infinite care, plucked the flower from the earth. She held it in her palm, its vibrant color a stark contrast to her calloused, dirt-stained skin. She felt a sudden, powerful urge to share this small discovery. It was too beautiful to keep to herself. Back at the cabin, she paused. Putting it in a cup of water on the small table felt too bold, too presumptuous, as if she were claiming a space inside that was not truly hers. The cabin was Carter's space, functional and sparse. A flower seemed a frivolous, feminine intrusion. Instead, she walked to the porch. There was a particular step, warmed by the afternoon sun, where Carter often sat to clean his tack or sharpen his knives. It was his spot. With a hesitant hand, she laid the single, bright yellow flower on the edge of the wooden step. It was a tiny offering, a silent message left in a shared space. It said, "I was here. I saw this. I thought it was beautiful." She then retreated into the cabin, her heart beating a little faster than usual, feeling both foolish and hopeful. That evening, they fell into their usual ritual. After a simple meal of stew and cornbread, they moved to the porch to watch the day die. Samuel sat on the steps, arranging a collection of smooth, gray stones into patterns only he could understand. Eliana had brought out a shirt of Carter's that needed mending, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric. Carter himself was working a piece of leather, his hands strong and sure. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the deepening twilight, his gaze fell upon the flower. Eliana, watching him from the corner of her eye, felt her breath catch. She saw him pause in his work. He looked at the small, bright blossom for a long, silent moment. She braced herself, expecting him to ignore it, or worse, to brush it away as an inconsequential piece of debris. But he did not. He set down his leatherwork, reached over, and picked up the marigold with a surprising gentleness. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, observing it in the fading light. He did not bring it to his nose to smell it, nor did he offer any sign of overt appreciation. He simply looked at it, his expression unreadable. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, He tucked the stem of the flower into the leather band of his hat, which rested on the porch beside him. He then picked up his work and resumed his task as if nothing had happened. Eliana lowered her head, a slow warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the cooling air. He had not spoken a word, but his action was an answer, loud and clear. He had accepted her gift. He had understood. The next morning, Eliana awoke to the familiar sounds of the homestead. She rose, dressed, and went out to the porch to begin her first chore of the day. Fetching water from the well, she stopped on the top step. Lying on the wooden boards, in the exact spot where she always sat to pull on her boots or to rest in the sun, was a piece of tanned deerskin. It was not a new piece. It was old and supple, worn soft with time and use. Its edges smooth, its surface holding the faint, clean scent of oil and wood smoke. It was folded neatly, a patch of rich, dark brown against the weathered gray of the porch. She stared at it, her mind slow to grasp its meaning. She looked toward the corral, where Carter was already tending to the horses, his back to her. He had put it there. He must have done it before she woke. She reached down and touched the leather. It was soft and smooth, a world away from the rough, splintery wood of the steppe. She understood then. This was his response. This was his flower. She had offered him a small, fleeting piece of beauty. In return, he had given her a lasting piece of comfort. It was a gesture of profound and quiet thoughtfulness. He had noticed where she sat. He had seen her small, daily habits. He had recognized a small discomfort she hadn't even consciously acknowledged herself. And he had provided a solution. It was the most practical, Carter-like gift imaginable, and it moved her more than any jewel or fine dress ever could. It was a silent conversation, a barter of kindnesses. Later that day, she was working in the small, tilled patch of earth they called a garden, pulling up the last of the stubborn weeds before the winter frost set in. Her hands were caked with rich, dark soil, her face smudged with dirt and sweat. She finished her work and walked toward the wash basin that sat on a bench beside the well, intending to clean up. Carter was at the well, drawing a fresh bucket. He saw her coming and, instead of leaving the bucket for her to use, he lifted it and walked to meet her. He picked up the metal dipper that hung from a nail and filled it with cool, clear water. She held her hands out over the basin, expecting him to pour the water into it. Instead, he moved closer and, tipping the dipper, began to pour a slow, steady stream of water directly into her cupped hands. The shock of it, the simple, stunning intimacy of the act, made her gasp. The water was shockingly cold, a delicious relief against her hot, dirty skin. It sluiced over her palms and through her fingers, carrying the dirt away. He kept pouring, his gaze fixed on her hands, until they were clean. When the last drop had fallen, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes met his. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath in the space of that shared gaze. Everything that had been unspoken between them was finally said. She saw in his eyes an acknowledgement of her, not just as a person he was protecting, but as a woman. She saw a quiet, steady tenderness that made her heart ache, and she hoped, she prayed, that he saw in hers the depth of her gratitude, the fragile, blooming hope that was taking root in her soul. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The wind whispered through the dry grass around them, and the sun warmed the back of her neck. He lowered the dipper, and she lowered her hands. The moment was over, but it had changed everything. That evening, as she sat on the porch, on the soft piece of deerskin he had left for her, she watched him and Samuel. She was no longer a ghost in this place, a temporary guest waiting for her time to be up. The flower, the leather, the water. They were the words of a new language they were building together. They were the cornerstones of a home. She was not just passing through his life. She was a part of it, and she was beginning to believe she would be for a very long time. The piece of that life, once a fragile and tentative thing, had become as solid and real as the sun-warmed logs of the cabin walls. The autumn days settled into a routine so deeply comforting it felt as if Eliana had never known another way of living. The world had shrunk to the size of their small homestead, and within its quiet borders, she had found not just safety, but a sense of self. The silence was no longer a void to be feared, but a shared language, a comfortable blanket woven between her, Carter, and the boy. That afternoon, the air was still and warm, holding the last vestiges of summer's heat. A gentle breeze, smelling of dry grass and distant pine, drifted up from the valley. Eliana was on the porch, mending one of Samuel's shirts, her needle making a soft, rhythmic thwick as it passed through the sturdy fabric. Samuel sat on the bottom step, meticulously arranging his collection of smooth, gray river stones into a long, serpentine line that snaked its way into the dust of the yard. His small face was a mask of concentration, his world completely absorbed by this simple, satisfying task. Her gaze drifted from the boy's bent head to the horizon. It was a habit now, a constant, unconscious scanning of the vast emptiness that surrounded them. The horizon was their wall, their moat, the defining feature of their solitude. But today, the wall had been breached. At first, it was nothing more than a faint disturbance, a smudge of dust against the brilliant, cloudless blue of the sky. So distant it might have been a trick of the light. She paused in her sewing, her needle hovering over the cloth. Travelers were almost non-existent in this remote corner of the territory. The two prospectors from weeks ago had been the first and only strangers she had seen since her arrival. She watched, her eyes narrowed against the glare. The smudge grew, slowly resolving itself into 3 distinct plumes of dust. 3 riders. They were moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Not the wandering gait of lost travelers, but the purposeful stride of men with a destination. And their destination was the hill. Their hill. A small, cold knot began to form in the pit of her stomach. She told herself it was foolish. They were likely just cowboys tracking a stray steer, or perhaps government surveyors. There was no reason for the sudden, prickling fear that traced a path up her spine. She glanced at the corral. Carter was not in sight. He had ridden out after the morning chores to check the snares he had set in the scrubland at the base of the mesas, a half-day's ride away. She was alone with the boy. The thought, which had been a comfort just moments before, was now a source of sharp, cold dread. The riders were closer now, cresting the final rise before the long, sloping path that led to the cabin. They were no longer just shapes. They were men on horseback. One was large and heavy in the saddle. The other 2 were leaner, their posture rigid and alert. They rode with a confidence that was less like cowboys and more like soldiers or hunters. And then the afternoon sun glinted off something on the chest of the lead rider, a silver concho on a leather vest, a specific, ornate design of a coiled snake. The needle fell from Eliana's numb fingers. The air rushed from her lungs as if she'd been struck. The world tilted, the peaceful afternoon dissolving into a nightmarish memory. The scent of beeswax and wilted lilies filled her nose. She was back in her father's church, standing at the altar, the cold weight of a wedding band on her finger. She could see Mr. Sterling, her husband, his cold, slate-colored eyes watching her, and standing behind him, just out of the corner of her eye, were his men, his enforcers, the men who collected his debts and protected his interests. The lead man, a cruel-mouthed brute named Finch, wore a vest with a single, ornate silver concho, a coiled snake. They had found her, after all these months, after she had allowed herself to believe she was free. They had found her. The cold knot in her stomach erupted into a geyser of pure, ice-cold terror. She scrambled to her feet, her chair clattering onto the porch. Samuel. Her voice was a strangled, broken thing. It was not a call, but a scream. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with alarm. He did not understand her word, but he understood the terror that contorted her face. He saw the direction of her frantic gaze and saw the three riders, now beginning their ascent up the trail. At the sound of her scream, Carter appeared. He seemed to materialize from the very air at the side of the cabin, moving with a speed and silence that was breathtaking. He must have been returning, must have been close enough to hear her cry. His face was a hard, grim mask, his eyes already fixed on the approaching riders. He held his rifle in one hand. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance: the men, her white-faced terror, the frozen boy. He understood everything in an instant. "Eliana," he said, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through her panic. "Take the boy, the cellar, now!" His words were a lifeline. She grabbed Samuel's small, unresisting hand and pulled him into the cabin. In the center of the room, under a rough bearskin rug, was the trapdoor to the root cellar. Carter had dug it himself, a small, dark, earth-smelling space where they kept their stores for the winter. It was their only hiding place. She ripped the rug aside and heaved the heavy wooden door open. "In, Samuel," quickly she urged, guiding the boy toward the dark opening. He scrambled down the short ladder without hesitation, his eyes still wide with a fear he couldn't comprehend. Just as she was about to follow, she heard the thunder of hooves in the yard, followed by a harsh, grating voice. "Sterling sends his regards. Boone, we've come for his property." Eliana froze on the edge of the cellar, her blood turning to ice. His property. That was all she was. A gunshot exploded, deafening in the small cabin. Wood splintered near the doorway. Carter fired back, the clean, sharp crack of his rifle a stark contrast to the rough boom of the attacker's pistols. "Get down," Carter yelled, his voice strained. She scrambled down the ladder, pulling the heavy trapdoors shut over her head, plunging them into a thick, suffocating darkness that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. She pulled Samuel close, her arms wrapped around his small, trembling body. He was preternaturally still, his face buried in her side, not making a sound. Above them, the world erupted into a storm of violence. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the cabin floor, the crash of furniture being overturned. She heard the men's voices, coarse and cruel, and Carter's, low and steady, though she couldn't make out the words. More gunshots, so close they made the very air in the cellar vibrate. A man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain that was cut short, then a sickening, heavy thud. Silence. A terrible, ringing silence that was worse than the noise. Eliana held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Was it over? Had Carter? She couldn't let herself finish the thought. Then, heavy footsteps directly above them. The bearskin rug was thrown aside. A sliver of light appeared as the trap door was wrenched open. Eliana shielded Samuel with her body, looking up into the face of a monster. It was Finch. His face was flushed, a long, bloody scratch running down one cheek. His eyes, small and cruel, glittered with triumph as he looked down at her. Behind him, another man lay groaning on the floor. The third was nowhere to be seen. "Well, well," Finch sneered, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "There's the runaway bride, Mr. Sterling is going to be very pleased. He wants you back in one piece. Mostly." He started down the ladder. Eliana scrambled backward, pushing Samuel behind her, until her back was pressed against the cool, damp wall of the cellar. There was nowhere else to go. Suddenly, a blur of motion from the corner of her eye, a heavy groan from the cabin floor above. Carter. He wasn't dead. He was pulling himself across the floor, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his shirt stained with a dark, spreading wetness. He was reaching for his rifle, which lay just out of his grasp. Finch saw him too. With a curse, he abandoned his descent and lunged for the boy. He grabbed Samuel by the front of his shirt and hauled him out of the cellar with a single, brutal motion. "No!" Eliana screamed, scrambling up the ladder after them. She emerged into a scene of utter devastation. The cabin was wrecked, and in the center of the room, Finch held the terrified, struggling Samuel in front of him like a shield. The boy's feet dangled inches from the floor, his face a mask of silent, wide-eyed terror. Finch held a long-barreled pistol to the side of Samuel's head. "Don't move! Boone!" Finch snarled at Carter, who had managed to get to his knees, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Or the boy gets it. I'll take the woman and go. You can live, make a move, and we all die." Eliana stood frozen, a spectator to her own nightmare. The sight of Samuel, so small and helpless, with a gun to his head, shattered the last remnants of her paralysis. A rage, white-hot and absolute, burned away her fear. It was a primal, protective fury she had never known she possessed. Her eyes darted around the room. Her gaze fell on Carter's gun belt, which he had unbuckled and hung on a peg by the door when he'd come inside. The Colt Peacemaker, its handle worn and smooth, was still in the holster. It was 10 feet away, an impossible distance. But on the floor, half hidden by an overturned crate, lay the pistol of the man Finch had shot. It was close, only a few feet away. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch into an eternity. Finch was distracted, his attention divided between Carter and keeping his grip on the struggling boy. Eliana took a single, slow, deliberate step sideways, then another. Finch didn't notice. Her heart was a wild drum in her ears. She lunged. She scooped up the pistol from the floor. It was shockingly heavy, cold and alien in her hand. She had never held a gun in her life. She straightened up, raising it with both hands to steady her violent trembling. She aimed it at Finch. Finch's head whipped around, his eyes widening in disbelief. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. You're going to shoot me? Little church mouse, you don't have the nerve." He was right. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the barrel pointed in his direction. The terrified, obedient girl, who had been raised to honor and obey, who had never made a choice for herself, was screaming in her head. But the woman who had tasted freedom, who had been shown kindness, who had come to love the silent boy now being used as a shield, was screaming louder. She looked past the gun, into Finch's cruel eyes, and then she looked at Samuel's terrified face, and she knew what she had to do. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar of fire and thunder that filled the small cabin. The recoil slammed her backward, and the gun fell from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor. She hadn't aimed, she had just pointed and fired, an act of pure, desperate will. The bullet went wide of Finch, but it struck the wall just beside his head, showering his face with splinters of wood and plaster. For a split second, Finch froze, his face a mask of stunned shock. The sheer, unexpected violence of her action had broken his nerve. He was a bully, a predator who preyed on the weak. He was not prepared to die here, in this remote cabin, at the hands of a terrified girl, for a paycheck. With a curse, he shoved Samuel away from him. The boy fell in a heap on the floor. Finch didn't spare another glance for her or for Carter. He turned and fled, stumbling out of the ruined cabin and into the fading afternoon light. A moment later, she heard the frantic drumming of a horse's hooves, galloping away in a desperate, cowardly retreat. The silence that descended was absolute. Eliana stared at the empty doorway, her body trembling from the aftershock of what she had just done. Then she heard a small, whimpering sound. Samuel. She rushed to him, gathering him into her arms, holding him tight. He was unhurt, just terrified. She held him for a long moment, her face buried in his hair, until her own ragged breathing began to slow. Then she looked across the room. Carter had collapsed. He lay on his side on the floorboards, a dark, glistening pool of red spreading out from under him. His eyes were closed, his face a waxy, unnatural white. "Carter," she whispered, the name a prayer. She scrambled to his side, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch. His blood was on the floor of their home. "Carter," she cried, her voice breaking. The sound of his name, the only thing in a world that had once again been shattered. The world narrowed to the four walls of the log cabin, and then narrowed further, to the small, fraught space around the bed where Carter Boone lay burning. The violent chaos of the attack had been replaced by a quiet, insidious battle, a siege fought not with guns but with whispered words and cool water, against an enemy that was inside the man himself. The first hour had been a frantic, desperate scramble against the encroaching darkness. Eliana, her mind numb with shock but her body moving with a will of its own, had somehow found a strength she didn't know she possessed. With the wide-eyed, silent Samuel pushing from behind, she had managed to drag Carter's dead weight from the blood-slicked floorboards to his cot. The effort left her gasping, her muscles screaming, but she did not stop. She tore strips from one of her few clean petticoats, her hands shaking so violently she could barely tie a knot. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, a brutal, ragged wound that she had no idea how to treat, remembering stories she'd overheard from traveling wranglers. She did the only thing she could think of. She poured whiskey into the wound, the raw stench of the alcohol mingling with the metallic smell of blood. Carter had convulsed, a deep, animal groan tearing from his throat. But he did not wake. She had bandaged him tightly, her work clumsy and desperate, a prayer in linen and pressure. The other man, one of Finch's companions, lay dead near the hearth, his eyes open and staring at the rafters. She had covered him with a horse blanket, a task that made her stomach heave, and then turned her back on him, focusing all her being on the man who was still alive. The broken door she barred with a heavy table. The immediate threat from the outside world was gone, but the true enemy was already within their walls. The fever took hold by nightfall. It came on like a prairie fire, fast and consuming. His skin, once cool and tanned, radiated a dry, searing heat. His quiet stillness was replaced by a restless tossing, the woolen blankets a cage he fought against. And he began to speak. His words were a broken torrent from a life she had never known. He was in a different place, a different time, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that filled the small cabin. He spoke of dust and cattle, of long, cold nights under the stars. He called out names, Ben, Maria, Jedediah in tones of command, of grief, of anger. He was reliving battles, both with men and with the land itself. Eliana sat by his side, a silent spectator to the ghosts that haunted him, the storms that raged under the quiet surface she had come to know. Her life became a series of small, sacred rituals. Every hour, she would lift his head and press a cup of water to his cracked lips, coaxing a few precious drops down his throat. She soaked cloths in cool water from the well and laid them on his forehead, his neck, his chest, fighting the fire that was consuming him from within. The cloths would be hot and steaming in moments, and she would repeat the process, an endless, tireless baptism against the heat. Time lost all meaning. There was only the cycle of light and dark outside the single window. The sun would rise, casting a pale, hopeful light across the floor, and she would feel a small surge of optimism. But the fever would hold. The sun would set, plunging the cabin into a deep, lonely darkness, and she would fight back despair, lighting a single candle whose small, flickering flame felt like her own fragile hope. Samuel was her shadow, her silent acolyte in this grim vigil. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation with an innate wisdom that belied his years. He never cried, never complained. He sat on the floor by the bed, a piece of slate and a nub of charcoal in his hands, and he would draw. He drew the cabin, the corral, the chickens. He drew a tall, stick-figure man with a wide-brimmed hat standing beside a small boy. He would sometimes get up, his movements as quiet as a moth's, and tug on her sleeve, holding out a piece of dry bread or a cup of water for her. his large, serious eyes urging her to take care of herself. In those moments, her resolve would harden. She was not just fighting for Carter. She was fighting for this small, broken family, for the fragile home they had built in the middle of nowhere. In the long, quiet hours of the night, with only the sound of Carter's ragged breathing and the whisper of the wind outside, she found herself reading to him. She had found a small, worn Bible in his saddlebags, its pages soft as cloth from use. She did not know if he was a man of faith, but the words were a comfort to her, a connection to a time before her father had twisted religion into a tool of control. She read the Psalms, her voice low and steady, a quiet melody against the discordant rasp of his fever. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she would whisper, the words a prayer for him, for them all. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters." Her voice was a steady anchor, an attempt to impose the calm and order of the verses onto the chaotic reality of the sick bed. She did not know if he could hear her, if the words penetrated the fog of his delirium, but she continued, because the act of reading was an act of faith. It was on the third night that she finally understood the nature of the feeling that had taken root in her soul. Carter was thrashing, lost in a particularly violent fever dream, his hands clenched into fists. He cried out, a sharp, wounded sound, and she reached out to soothe him, to place a hand on his arm. His hands shot out and grabbed hers, his grip surprisingly strong, desperate. He was not grabbing at her, but to her, a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. His eyes were closed, his face contorted in some unseen struggle, but his fingers were locked around hers. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long, the fear of Mr. Sterling, of Finch, of the vast, lonely world, it all just vanished. It was burned away by the heat of his skin, by the desperate strength in his hand. All that was left was a fierce, powerful certainty. She was not afraid anymore. His touch, even in its unconsciousness, was not a threat but an anchor. It was the confirmation of everything she had begun to feel. She did not know when it had happened. There was no single moment, no lightning strike. It had grown slowly, quietly, in the shared silence, in the lessons on tying knots, in the offering of a flower and the gift of a piece of leather. It had taken root in the bedrock of the safety he had provided. She had thought he was the one protecting her, but now, sitting in the dark with her hand clasped in his, she realized that they were protecting each other. Love, she understood now, was not the cold, dutiful thing her father had preached. It was this quiet, desperate, unbreakable bond, this refusal to let go. She did not pull her hand away. She sat there for the rest of the night, her fingers entwined with his anchor and he hers, until the first gray light of dawn crept into the cabin. The fever broke on the 5th day. It happened not with a crash, but like a tide slowly receding. The searing heat of his skin gave way to a drenching sweat. His ragged, shallow breathing deepened, becoming slow and even. The restless thrashing ceased, and for the first time in days, he fell into a true, deep sleep. Eliana watched him, her heart caught in her throat. She did not dare to hope too much, but she could not help herself. She continued her vigil, wiping the sweat from his brow, feeling the life slowly, tentatively, returning to him. She dozed in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still resting near his. She awoke to a profound silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The quality of the light in the room had changed. It was the soft, golden light of late afternoon. She sat up, her back stiff, and looked at him. His eyes were open. They were clear. The fever-bright glaze was gone. They were his eyes, the color of a winter sky, and they were looking directly at her. She stared, unable to breathe, to speak. 1,000 words, 1,000 emotions, swirled inside her, but none could find their way out. He blinked slowly, his gaze taking in her face, her exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes. His lips moved, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He swallowed, a pained, difficult motion, and tried again. His voice was a mere ghost of its former self, a dry whisper of sand and gravel. Still here. The two words were not a question about his survival. They were not about the fight, or the fever, or the pain. They were about her. Through the fog of delirium and the shadow of death, his first conscious thought had been of her presence, of her staying. It was too much. The dam of her composure, the wall of strength she had built over the past 5 nightmarish days, did not just crack, it disintegrated. A sob, raw and ragged, tore from her throat. The tears she had refused to shed finally came, a hot, cleansing flood. She buried her face in her hands and wept, not from sadness or fear, but from a wave of relief so profound, so all-consuming. It felt like the breaking of a storm. She was still here, and so was he. And for now, that was everything. The days that followed were forged in a new kind of silence. The taut, watchful silence of survival had been broken, replaced by the quiet, breathing stillness of recovery. Winter began to settle on the high desert, a slow, creeping chill that sharpened the air and bleached the last stubborn colors from the landscape. Inside the small cabin, a fragile world was being meticulously rebuilt, one slow breath, one small action at a time. Carter's recovery was a lesson in infuriated patience. For a man accustomed to ceaseless motion and physical dominance over his environment, the weakness was a cage. The first time he tried to stand, the effort left him gasping, his face pale and slick with sweat, his full weight collapsing against Ellie's smaller frame. In that moment, their roles were completely inverted. She, who had once been the fragile one seeking his protection, was now the pillar, her slight body braced and unyielding, holding him up. She guided him back to the cot, her touch gentle but firm, and he submitted with a low, frustrated growl that was directed at himself, not at her. His dependence forged a new, unspoken intimacy between them. There was no room for propriety when she had to help him change the dressing on his shoulder, her fingers working deftly to clean and rebind the wound. There was no space for distance when she had to spoon broth into his mouth because his hands were too unsteady to hold the spoon himself. She performed these tasks with a quiet, solemn focus, her movements efficient and devoid of any self-consciousness. This was not the work of a servant, nor the duty of a wife. It was simply a necessary act of care, a physical manifestation of the vow she had made to herself in the darkest hours of his fever. He would not fall while she was there to hold him. Samuel was their quiet accomplice in this slow dance of healing. He would watch Carter with his large, serious eyes, and then, without being asked, he would fetch things: a cup for water, a piece of firewood for the stove. He would sit for hours on the floor by Carter's bed, whittling a piece of soft pine with the knife Carter had taught him to use, the soft scrape of the blade a comforting, domestic sound. He was a constant, calming presence, a living symbol of what they had fought to protect. As Carter's strength began to return, the focus of their energy shifted from his body to their home. The cabin bore the scars of the attack like a wounded animal. The front door, splintered and broken, hung from a single hinge. Furniture was overturned and smashed. The floor was stained with a dark memory she tried not to look at too closely. The day Carter first picked up a tool was a turning point. He was still weak, his movements slow and deliberate. But he retrieved his hammer and a handful of nails and began the painstaking work of repairing the door. Ellie worked alongside him, clearing away the shattered wood, holding boards in place while he hammered. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their shared purpose was a language in itself. The rhythmic, steady tapping of the hammer was the sound of them reclaiming their sanctuary, of driving out the ghosts of violence with the honest, productive work of their own hands. Next came the fence around the small yard. Finch's horse had trampled a section of it in his panicked retreat. Carter, his left arm still bound in a sling, worked with one hand, setting new posts with a grim determination. Ellie would fetch the rails, dragging them into place, her muscles burning with the effort. They worked from sunrise to sunset, two solitary figures against the vast, empty landscape, moving in a synchronized, silent rhythm. They were not just building a fence, they were re-establishing their border with the world, defining the small patch of earth that was theirs. The rhythm of their days settled into a quiet, enduring pattern. The grand, terrifying events of the past became a distant echo, replaced by the immediate, tangible reality of their shared life. Their world was one of small, significant acts. She would spend the mornings mending. She repaired the tear in Carter's coat, her stitches small and neat, weaving herself into the very fabric of his life. She patched the knee of Samuel's trousers, her heart swelling with a fierce, maternal tenderness that was entirely new to her. She was not just a guest in this home. She was becoming its heart, the quiet center that held it all together. He would work outside, his strength returning with each passing day. He chopped firewood, the clean, sharp ring of the axe a reassuring heartbeat against the winter silence. He reinforced the roof of the chicken coop, his movements once again economical and precise. He was the silent, steady guardian, the provider, the physical wall that stood between their small, warm world and the cold indifference of the wilderness. They took their meals at the small wooden table, the silence between them as comfortable and familiar as an old blanket. There were no pleasantries, no forced conversation. There was only the scrape of forks on tin plates, the crackle of the fire, the occasional glance that passed between them, a look that could convey a universe of meaning. He would notice her cup was empty and refill it from the water bucket. She would see him rubbing his sore shoulder and would fetch the herbal salve she had made. It was a language of observation, of anticipation, of quiet, selfless care. One afternoon, she was out in the garden patch, turning over the soil for the last time before the ground froze solid. It was hard, back-breaking work. Carter was at the corral, reshoeing one of the horses. The sun was warm on her back, and she worked until her hands were raw and her brow was beaded with sweat. She straightened up, pressing a hand to her aching back, and saw him walking toward her from the well, the wooden dipper in his hand. He stopped in front of her, the pail of cool, fresh water in his other hand. He said nothing, simply held out the dipper to her. She reached for it, her dirt-caked fingers wrapping around the smooth, worn handle. As she took it, her hand brushed against his. It was a simple, accidental touch, the kind of fleeting contact that happens a dozen times a day. But this time, neither of them pulled away. For a long, suspended moment, their hands rested together on the handle of the dipper. She could feel the rough, warm calluses of his palm against the backs of her fingers, the steady, solid strength in his grip. She looked up from their joined hands and met his eyes. The air grew still, and the world seemed to narrow to the small space between them. In his gaze, she saw no walls, no shadows from the past. She saw only a quiet, profound acknowledgement, a reflection of the same deep, unspoken truth that was blooming in her own heart. A realization, gentle and absolute, settled over her. He was no longer just Carter Boone, the silent cowboy who had saved her. He was not her rescuer, not her guardian. He was the anchor of her world. He was the quiet center of her new life. He was home. Slowly, reluctantly, she let her hand slip from the dipper. She took it and drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. But the feeling of his hand against hers lingered, a warm and permanent brand. The small, symbolic exchanges continued, a quiet conversation that needed no words. One morning, she found a cluster of stubborn, late-blooming Indian paintbrush, their vibrant red a shock against the muted landscape. She brought them inside and, finding an empty tin can, placed them in the center of the table. It was a small, simple act, an injection of color and grace into their functional, masculine world. She worried it might be a frivolous intrusion, but she felt a deep need to add her own small mark of beauty to their shared space. She said nothing about it. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she noticed that Carter was not cleaning his tack as he usually did. He had a small, leather-bound notebook and a piece of charcoal in his hands. He was drawing, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft, his focus absolute. She could not see what he was sketching. Later, after he had gone to bed, her curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the notebook he had left on the mantelpiece. She opened it to the last page. He had not drawn the vast landscape, or a horse, or the cabin. He had drawn a single, perfect flower petal, its delicate shape and veins rendered with a startling, tender precision. He had seen her offering, and in his own silent way, he had honored it, preserved it, made it a permanent part of his world. A soft smile touched her lips. She placed a fresh log on the fire and looked around the small, warm cabin. She saw her mending basket in the corner, his rifle resting on its pegs above the door, Samuel's carved wooden horse lying by the hearth. Each object was a testament to their new life. Each was a verse in the silent poem they were writing together. He built the fences that kept them safe. She planted the seeds that would feed them. He provided the wood that kept them warm. She mended the clothes that covered them. Each with their own hands, each with their own tasks, but always, and forever, under a single shared roof. The days of running were over. These were the days that would stay. Spring did not arrive on the high desert. It waged a quiet, determined war against the tyranny of winter. For months, the world had been a stark etching of black and white the dark. Skeletal branches of the scrub oak against the bone-white snow. The sharp, black rocks piercing through a frozen landscape. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. It started with the sound of water, a soft, secret trickling as the ice that had locked the earth began to relent. The sun, which had been a distant, indifferent disk in the sky, found a new warmth, a new strength. The snow receded, not in a great, messy flood, but in patches, surrendering the south-facing slopes first, and in the damp, dark earth left behind. The first signs of life appeared, tiny, vibrant green shoots, so delicate they seemed impossible, pushed their way up through the cold soil. Eliana would kneel in the yard, touching a new blade of grass with a sense of reverence, a witness to a miracle she had never before had the patience to notice. Then the color came. It began as a faint blush on the hillsides, a pale purple haze of wild verbena. Soon it was joined by the defiant, sunny yellow of the desert marigolds and the fiery orange of the Indian paintbrush. Within a few weeks, the valley floor, which had been a monotonous sea of winter brown, was transformed into a breathtaking tapestry of color. The land, which had demanded so much of them, which had tested them with its harshness, was now offering a gift of astonishing, profligate beauty. The cabin, their small, hand-built fortress, seemed to soften in the spring light. The grim necessity of survival gave way to the gentle rhythms of life. The days grew longer, warmer, filled with the drone of bees and the scent of wild sage on the breeze. Carter's shoulder had healed into a puckered, angry scar, a permanent reminder of the violence that had nearly torn their world apart. But his strength had returned completely, and with it, the quiet, easy competence that defined him. He and Eliana moved around each other in a dance of such practiced familiarity that it was as if they had been doing it for a lifetime. There was no need for words. A glance, a nod, a small gesture was all that was required. They were two halves of a single, functioning whole. He would rise before dawn to hunt or check his trap lines. She would have coffee boiling on the stove when he returned. She would spend the morning tending her garden, coaxing tender green shoots of beans and squash from the rich soil. He would spend it reinforcing the corral or mending a piece of tack. Their work was separate but intertwined, each of them contributing a vital thread to the fabric of their shared life. It was on one of those perfect late spring afternoons that it happened. The sky was a high, flawless blue, and a gentle wind, cool and sweet, was blowing up from the valley. They had just finished replacing a rail on the fence line at the edge of the hill, the same fence they had built together in the cold, uncertain days of his recovery. The new wood was pale and fragrant against the weathered gray of the older posts. Their work was done, but neither of them made a move to leave. They stood side by side, leaning against the top rail, their shoulders almost touching. Below them, the valley was a riot of wildflowers, a rolling sea of purple, yellow, and red. Samuel was a short distance away, a small, solitary figure in the vast landscape, completely absorbed in his own world. He was carefully gathering the fallen blue and gray feathers of a scrub jay, his small treasures. For a long time, they just stood in comfortable silence, watching the play of light and shadow on the valley floor, listening to the whisper of the wind through the grass. It was a silence filled with everything they had been through together, the fear, the pain, the quiet healing, the slow, steady building of this life. Eliana looked at Carter's profile against the blue sky. The harsh lines of his face were softened by the afternoon light. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his expression calm and settled. He was a part of this landscape, as solid and enduring as the mesas in the distance, and she, who had once been a fragile, wind-blown thing, had found her roots here, in this hard, stony ground, beside this quiet, immovable man. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the terrified girl on the stagecoach, the whispered confession in the dark of a ruined barn, the desperate, trembling act of firing a gun. It all felt like a story about someone else, a ghost from a different lifetime. The woman who stood here now was not that girl. This woman was strong. This woman was home. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, carried on the breeze, but steady and clear. It was the culmination of months of unspoken feeling, a truth that had finally ripened in the quiet soil of her heart. "When I first saw you," she began, her gaze fixed on the field of flowers, "I was just looking for a shadow to hide in, a place to be invisible for a moment, until the danger passed." She paused, gathering her thoughts, choosing her words with the same care she used to plant a seed. "I only wanted to ask if I could hide behind you," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now?" She turned her head, her eyes finally meeting his. "Now, I just want to stand beside you, through all of it, the sun and the rain." The words were a simple, unadorned declaration. It was not a plea or a request. It was a statement of fact, a statement of choice. It was the truest thing she had ever said in her life. Carter did not speak. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, searched hers, and in their clear, quiet depths, she saw her own truth reflected back at her. He had heard not just her words, but the lifetime of meaning behind them. He raised his hand, his movement slow and deliberate, and his calloused thumb came up to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm and rough, and a shiver of pure, unadulterated joy ran through her. He leaned in. He did not kiss her lips. The first kiss, the one in the dusty yard of the ruined homestead, had been a question, a shocking, breathtaking offer of a different path. This was the answer. He lowered his head, the brim of his hat casting a brief shadow over her face, and pressed his lips to her forehead. The kiss was not a spark. It was an anchor dropping into the deepest, quietest part of her soul. It was a kiss of breathtaking tenderness, a silent and absolute vow. It was a promise of protection, a seal of belonging, a gesture of reverence. It held the quiet strength of the mountains, the gentle warmth of the spring sun, the enduring patience of the earth itself. It was the second kiss of her life, and this time She knew it was forever. He pulled back, his hand still resting on her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His eyes held hers, and in the profound, unbreakable silence that passed between them, everything was settled. They did not need a preacher to sanctify their union. Her only experience with a man of God had been a transaction that had sold her into misery. They did not need a ring to bind them together. The only ring she had ever worn had been a cold, golden shackle. They did not need a piece of paper, signed and witnessed in a dusty courthouse, to declare their commitment. The only contracts she had known had been chains. They had something far more powerful. They had a choice. He had chosen to offer a path to a desperate, fleeing girl, and she, in turn, had chosen to take it. They had chosen to fight for this life, to build it from the dust with their own hands. They had chosen to stand together against the violence of the world. And now, in the golden light of a spring afternoon, surrounded by a field of impossible flowers, they were choosing each other, completely and for all time. Samuel came running up to them then, his small hands filled with his collection of bright feathers, his face alight with the pure, uncomplicated joy of his discovery. He held them up for them to see, and Carter reached down and ruffled his hair, a rare, open gesture of affection. Eliana looked at the two of them, the tall, silent man who was her home, and the small, silent boy who was her heart and a sense of peace so deep and absolute, it felt like a prayer settled over her. She reached out and took Carter's hand, her fingers lacing through his. He did not pull away. His hand tightened around hers, a solid, reassuring weight, and together, the three of them turned and began to walk back to the small log cabin on the hill, their long shadows stretching out behind them in the fading light of the day. Thank you for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.